When you watched the video titled Introduction to Stock Issues, you learned a little bit about inherency. And you learned that inherency is a debate about whether there is a problem stuck in the status quo. When we mean stuck, we simply mean that there isn't a strong likelihood that the problem is going to go on away on its own. Plus, stuck is like tape, which adheres or sticks, like inherency. Okay, laugh all you want, but they really are from the same root word. During the inherency debate, the affirmative will argue that there is a problem stuck in the status quo that is unlikely to be fixed without someone doing something about it. And what do you know? The affirmative team has a plan to do something about it. Since we can reasonably predict what the affirmative team will claim in their inherency argument, let's switch perspectives and talk about how the negative team handles inherency. The negative team has a few strategic options, and one option is to simply agree with the affirmative. That's not always the worst strategy because A, you might be wasting your time debating an argument you can't win, and B, you might not have enough time to make better arguments. Even if you agree, you should still take a few seconds to say something like, let's go to their first contention, inherency, where they tell you that there's a problem stuck in the status quo. We don't disagree, and today's round will not focus on whether there's a problem, but on whether the affirmative plan is the right solution. So let's move on to solvency. A few sentences can go a long way in helping the judge and the other team know that you didn't drop the argument or forget about it. You're just not spending much time on it. But before you begin kicking inherency, let's take a deeper look at inherency to see if there's something worth debating, because most often there is. We'll begin by talking about the term inherent barrier. This is an impressive term to describe a simple concept. Why is the problem stuck? Is it stuck because nobody cares about the problem? Is it stuck because there are no good solutions out there? Or is it stuck because it costs too much to fix? Whatever the reason, a good negative team will want to ask in cross-examination what the inherent barrier is. And a good affirmative team will know that there are 4 types of inherent barriers. And the best way to remember them is with the acronym SAGE, S-A-G-E. First, let's start with S, which stands for structural barrier. A structural barrier means that there is a law or treaty or policy that keeps the problem in place. For example, you could argue that the Patriot Act authorizes the use of domestic surveillance, and that would be an example of a structural barrier because it's a part of an established law. There is some structure in place that prevents the problem from being solved. The next letter is A, which stands for attitudinal barrier. As you can guess, attitudinal barrier means that there are some prevailing or popular attitudes that keep the problem in place. For example, Americans want to feel safe from terrorist attacks, so we allow the government to steadily increase its surveillance of the American people. And as long as that attitude is in place, the problem will remain in place as well. The next letter is G, which stands for gap barrier. A gap barrier means that there is some sort of problem with all the solutions we've tried before. So the affirmative team might claim that all previous efforts to keep us safe have focused on metadata instead of actual public behavior. Then there would be a gap between adjusting the way we collected data. A gap barrier also means that there are solutions working at other smaller levels that haven't been tried before on a larger level. So let's say the state of Idaho is working with federal government to safely curtail surveillance, and the affirmative team proposes to close that gap by implementing the Idaho program on a national level. The final letter is E, which stands for existential barrier, and it's the easiest to understand. An existential barrier really just means that the solution didn't exist until the affirmative team thought of it. First, it didn't exist. Then the affirmative team dreamed up the plan, which means now it exists, and voila, the problem is solved. Existential barriers are hard for the affirmative team to prove, and even harder to prove when they work. But for those rare affirmative plans that truly didn't exist beforehand, this is the type of inherent barrier they would claim. Structural, attitudinal, gap, and existential. These are the 4 types of inherent barriers. An affirmative team should be prepared to explain why no solution has worked until now. If you encounter an affirmative team who isn't able to really pinpoint why the problem is stuck, they'll have a harder time proving that the problem really is stuck. So let's move on to our second acronym, CPR. CPR stands for cause, permanence, and repair, and those are each solid starting points for the negative team to examine the inherency claims. First, let's talk about cause. In other words, what's causing the problem? I can tell you that this is one of the most common errors I see in affirmative plans. The affirmative team talks about the problem until they are blue in the face, and then they propose a plan that doesn't fix the cause of the problem. And unless you know the cause of the problem, you cannot ensure that the plan will solve the problem. Using our surveillance example, let's say that the affirmative team claims that drones cause us to feel unsafe. But what if it's terrorists, not drones, that make us feel unsafe? If so, the cause of the problem would actually get worse if we implemented the affirmative plan and eliminated drones. And remember that the affirmative team has the burden of proof. So don't be afraid, as the negative team, to make that affirmative team show you the evidence from reputable sources that clearly isolates and explains the cause of the problem. And then see if the solution addresses those underlying causes or just nibbles around the edges. After all, if you can prove that the affirmative plan won't solve the problem because it doesn't address the root cause, you have a very powerful argument. The second letter in our acronym is P, which stands for permanence. Permanence is a debate about whether the problem is permanent. The affirmative team should be prepared to show that the problem will remain stuck until a solution is proposed. If the problem is only temporary, however, then maybe we don't need to make drastic changes. Perhaps the negative could show that the drone program is already scheduled to be phased out. The third and final letter of our acronym is R, which stands for repairs, specifically minor repairs. A minor repair is a small change hypothetically proposed by the negative team as an example of something far less expensive or intrusive that will accomplish the same outcome with the same advantages. For example, the negative team could say something like, if drones are so scary to the American people, would we be as scared if there were pilots in those planes? There are three important things to note about minor repairs. First, in order to suggest a minor repair, you have to be careful about whether you are admitting that the problem exists. You will note from my example that I started out with the phrase, if drones are so scary. And by doing so, I'm not admitting that they are scary. I'm only saying that if it is true, then maybe there might be a better way to solve it. Second, and more importantly, when you offer a minor repair, you are just offering the idea as a hypothetical test of the affirmative plan. You aren't actually proposing a counterplan, which is much more complex and difficult to do effectively. In other words, you aren't really proposing that we do your idea. You're just using the idea to test whether the affirmative plan is really the best approach. If the minor repair is a better idea, then the affirmative plan is a worse idea, and that's the point you're trying to make. Third, you want to make sure that your minor repair is smaller than the affirmative plan, thus the emphasis on the word minor. If you propose a hypothetical alternative that's just as expensive or complex as the affirmative, you really aren't offering a minor repair, you're just offering an alternative plan, and we call that a counterplan, and that's a much different argument. You know, to be honest, in the world of debate, inherency is often the most frequently ignored argument. The fact that we are debating the topic in the first place is probably sufficient evidence to prove that a problem exists. So as you continue with your debate into your advanced years, you might find that inherency receives the least amount of attention in your debates. Nevertheless, negative teams that are able to prove that the affirmative team misunderstands the problem itself can present some very compelling arguments in the round. We framed this video through the perspective of the negative team, but since you'll be the affirmative team half the time, let's talk about that too. And this part is pretty short and sweet. Make sure that when you are affirmative, you can predict and answer everything you would have run against your own plan if you were negative. Know your inherent barrier, know the cause of the problem, know that whether the problem is temporary, and know if there are simpler ways to solve the problem. And even more importantly, find evidence from credible sources to prove all of this. So in closing, let's review our major terms. Inherency, inherent barrier, SAGE, structural barrier, attitudinal barrier, gap barrier, existential barrier, CPR, cause, permanence, repairs, as in minor repairs. And remember that the affirmative team has the burden of proof for all stock issues. If they can't prove that a problem is stuck in the status quo, they shouldn't be winning the round. That's all for now. Good luck, debaters.